as we've said regularly, when we talk about this series that we're in called what is it called? The Unusual Suspects. I was going to say the Unsuspects. No, they're not unsuspects. They're the unusual suspects. That we're talking about an actual, real resurrection, that somebody really did come back from the dead. I don't know if you can think about this, but if you attended somebody's funeral and the next day you saw them walking down the street and a lot of people saw it, do you think it would make the newspapers? Do you think that would be a news story? Yes, it would. This was an incredible news story. That's why it changed the world, because it was spread. We're going to see this next week. It wasn't spread by the Bible. The Bible wasn't even around. It wasn't spread by theology. Theology wasn't even around. It was spread by eyewitnesses that saw him die and saw him live. It's pretty hard to beat that, isn't it? And that's the power in it. But like we've said every week as we've been going through this series, in order for somebody to come back to life, for Jesus to come back to life, that means there has to be a death. There has to be a death. So the death of Jesus is central to this. And Jesus didn't die of natural causes. It wasn't like, wow, somebody was sick and he came back to life. That's cool. Didn't die of some sickness. Didn't die from some camel collision. There was a casualty in that. Didn't die from any of this. On the divine side, it was extremely intentional. Planned for thousands of years throughout history. You can read about it in the Old Testament. Been foretold by the prophets. Jesus, God in the flesh, the Holy One of God, was at one time going to come down to this earth to become the Lamb of God to atone for the sins of the world. But on the human side, his death was equally as intentional. Equally as intentional. And the unfolding of the story is what we've been looking at. Those who were involved and masterminded it, those who were behind it, and those who were affected by it. So this morning we're going to wrap this up. We talked about several. You can get online if you want to catch the rest of this series. But we're going to wrap it up by looking at a guy whose name we don't know. But he constantly shows up in the retelling of the story of Jesus, of the death and resurrection of Jesus. And this particular unnamed person is a condemned criminal. Some of you'd suspect that, by golly, when the end is imminent, he'd be grasping at any hope of the divine he could possibly lay his hands on. But he wasn't that way. Very unusual. Now, one of the things I find in him that, quite honestly, I have heard in many, many conversations with people that I've had is this. People confuse life with God. Hang with me on this. People confuse life with God and define God, through the lens of their own personal experience. Now, let me read this again, because this really needs to resonate with us. People confuse life with God, and they define him through the lens of their own personal experience. So if life is good, God is good. If life is bad, God is bad. You ever felt that way? And if life is really, really, really bad, and you keep on experiencing huge disappointments, it's easy to assume there is no God out there who cares. There is no God out there who is personal. In fact, there may not even be any God at all. Life and God get confused, so disappointment with life becomes disappointment with God. Are we tracking here? Disappointment with life becomes disappointment with God. And I understand this. This is such an easy way to begin to think. When your dreams don't come true, when they just don't come through, things aren't working out, when you can't seem to catch a break and everybody else seems to be doing just fine. When somebody tells you just to pray and trust God, and you pray and trust God and things don't change, after a while, you begin to use your life experience to determine what God is like. Is God good, or is he not good? Is he personal and caring, or is he not personal and caring? And as these disappointments increase, it's easy for them to morph into, like we said, disappointment with God. They can even take you to a place where you just stop flat believing in God at all, or he's some distant force out there. Now, this I really believe was the case with today's character, because his life had spun completely out of control, and he finds himself in a Roman jail. Most people think jails at that time were just holes in the ground. He was deep holes under. He was probably underground, and he's condemned to death because he's so bad. He's not even useful as a slave anymore. He's so bad they can't even put him rowing in the galley of a Roman ship. His only value is to illustrate to a conquered people, the people of Israel, the futility of defying Rome. So he's condemned to be crucified publicly on a Roman cross. And I'm pretty sure this man had seen crucifixions before. He knew what he was in for. He knew he'd fight. He knew he'd curse. He knew he'd scream. He knew he'd be defiant. But in the end, he knew death would win, that he'd end up getting peeled down from a cross, dumped into a cart, dragged out to the south side of the city where his body would be dumped in the valley of Gehenna, which was the city dump. And no one would even be given permission for him to take his body. It was going to stay in the dump. He was to die as a common criminal, but he decided that he was going to die just as he lived. He decided he was going to die very defiantly, and on the morning of his execution, he's dragged out of the prison, and he discovers he won't be dying alone. He just discovers that there's two others who are going to be crucified with him. Perhaps he knew one of them, because one of them was another criminal, just like himself. We don't know. But the other he discovers is this Jewish rabbi from Nazareth by the name of Jesus. Whether we've heard of him or not, he'd heard of him or not, we don't know. And maybe the only silver lining is, because this is kind of unusual to have a rabbi being crucified, it would draw a larger crowd so he could curse more people. Now Luke, who wasn't a follower of Jesus until after Jesus' resurrection, he later did a very detailed investigation of Jesus' life, because he wanted to provide the chronological events of the life of Jesus from his birth through his death and through his resurrection. And to do this, he interviewed every eyewitness he could find. And then he recorded his findings in a document. And this document was so accurate that people began meticulously copying it, passing it around, because people were very interested in the details of Jesus' life. And about 200 years later, this document that he had written and that had been copied, we today know it as the Gospel of Luke, and it got bound into a book that today we call the Bible. Okay, so he wasn't commissioned to write a story of Jesus by the Bible Commission. Okay, he did this long before there was ever a Bible. He was just interviewing and writing down so people could find out what it was. And here's what Luke records about this event we're about to look at. Luke chapter 23, starting at verse 32. Two other men, both criminals, were also led out with him to be executed. When they came to the place called the Skull, it's because if you look at this, it's topography, it's kind of a cliff, and there's holes in it. It kind of looks like a skull. So they called it the place of the skull, Golgotha, Calvary. It all went by all those names. There they crucified him there, along with the criminals, one on his right and the other on his left. Now, I'm assuming many of you, if you've been around church, have probably heard or read these verses before. And it's very easy to skim over verses like this and just keep on going, but there's a lot packed in to just a few words. There's a lot of noise going on. There's a lot of commotion going on. There's all kinds of pain. There's all kinds of terror. There's all kinds of violence. There's so much agony that's on this square footage on the top of this mountain. It took hours and hours and hours, and sometimes several days, 2 to 3 days, for someone to die, because crucifixion was not always done the same way. Sometimes it was done with rope and nails, and sometimes it was done with just nails. And sometimes it was done with just rope. The Romans had perfected crucifixion as a way to achieve the ultimate suffering. They were masters at this. And in the midst of all this screaming, in the midst of all the pain and the commotion and the violence, as the two guys are spewing out profanity to all the spectators who have gathered, they hear the guy in the middle, they hear this Jewish rabbi utter words that you rarely would ever hear coming from a Roman cross. Verse 34, Jesus said, Father, Forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. Father, forgive them. While the Roman soldiers are gambling to split up everything that he owned, while the man to his left and his right are dying, while all his enemies are celebrating, Jesus prays for them. He prays for them. And it wasn't just the curious he was praying for who'd come out of the city to line up the hills and along the walls to watch this spectacle. Luke tells us there was another group of people that were there as well. It was the Jewish religious leaders. They were the ones who had masterminded the whole thing. They had masterminded his arrest, and they had got Rome to go along with the crucifixion. They were the ones who were threatened by his authority. They were threatened by his miracles. They were threatened by his stories and his words and his popularity. And as if it wasn't enough that they had manipulated the system and finally won, they wanted to push the envelope a little bit further. Look what it says here in the next verse, verse 35. The people stood watching, and the rulers even sneered at him. They had to get one more dig in. They even sneered at him. They said, he saved others. Let him save himself if he's God's Messiah, the chosen one. These were the ones that had the most to lose from Jesus' success. They were the ones who were constantly shamed by his answers when they asked them questions. But now the end was coming. There'd be no more humiliating answers. There'd be no more fear of the popularity he was gaining. Now they would be in charge. And this was the moment to take out their anger and take out the revenge that building up inside of them for 3 years. And then there was another group who joined in on the mocking. Look at the next verse, verse 36. The soldiers also came up and mocked him, saying, if you're the king of the Jews, save yourself. There was a written notice above him which read, this is the King of the Jews. Now they refer to him in their dialogue here, mocking him, as King of the Jews because Pilate, when he had decided to execute Jesus, he had decided to put a sign to hang over his head. And this is what that sign would say. This is the King of the Jews. So the Jewish leaders took quite the offense at this. And they told Pilate that he needed it, that was wrong. What he needed to say was he claimed to be the King of the Jews. But Pilate said, no, it's going to stay just like it is, King of the Jews. Because I want everyone to know that anyone who ever claims to be king, anyone who would ever defy Caesar, this is what they can expect to happen to them because Rome will not smile on this. So the Roman soldiers play off this and they mock him as King of the Jews. And then finally, as if this wasn't enough, Matthew, who was another one of Jesus' followers during his lifetime, and he also wrote about these events. He was no doubt there when all this was happening. Here's what he writes in Matthew chapter 27 and verse 44. In the same way, the robbers, both of them, sometimes we think just one of them were involved in this, they were both mocking Jesus too. The robbers who were crucified with him also heaped insults on him. Maybe they just couldn't stand Jesus' passive resignation to his circumstances. And so they began to pile on the abuse as well. And I think there's a reason for this one guy's abuse that is kind of picked up in the text. Let's go back to Luke, and now Luke 23, verse 39. It says, one of the criminals who hung there hurled insults at him. Aren't you the Messiah? Save yourself and us. If you're really the Messiah, this wouldn't be happening to you. And if you're really the Messiah, and if there really is a just and righteous and good and personal God who cares, this wouldn't be happening to us either. So save yourself and save us. But you're not the Christ. You're not the Christ. You can't save yourself, and you certainly can't save us either. Besides, if there really were a good God, none of this would be happening in the first place. There's no justice in the world, and there's certainly no caring, good, personal God. But you know what I find interesting in this? This is just my imagination. If either of them had said in this moment, "Where's God? Where's God in all this?" The answer would be, right next to you. Right next to you. Just a few feet away. But then suddenly, in the midst of all this chaos, in the midst of all this pain, and in the midst of all these insults, suddenly one of the criminals, again, we don't know his name, begins to sense there's something strangely different about this rabbi. Something strangely selfish about this Jewish teacher from Nazareth. And you just wish you could get inside the brain, get inside the mind, but I just kind of think something starts to dawn on him, and he goes, wait a minute. This truly is a righteous man. He really might be the one that I've been taught since I was a kid that was going to be sent from God. Maybe we've got it all wrong. But the other criminal's not buying it at all. So he turns to the other criminal, and he says this in verse 40. He says, but the other criminal rebuked him. And he said, don't you fear God? You're about to die. Don't you fear God? Since you're under the same sentence that he is. Verse 41 goes on. We are punished justly. We're getting what our deeds deserve. But this man has done nothing wrong. Something started to dawn on him. This man has done nothing wrong. And I kind of think his brain must have gone, and he goes, wait. I think I see something. Here is a man who's suffering just like we're suffering, but he's not abandoned his faith in God. He actually is calling him Father. Here's a man who's suffering unjustly, and yet somehow he's still able to maintain faith in God. Here's a man who's suffering the exact same fate that we are. Here's a man who's experiencing life just like we are, and he still addresses God as his Father. This is a man who's not drawing conclusions about God based on how life treats him or based on how other people treat him. And he suddenly begins to see Jesus in a way that nobody in the crowd sees him. Certainly not the criminal next to him sees him. If an innocent man who suffers like a guilty man can maintain faith in God, if an innocent man who's experiencing life the same way I'm experiencing life, if an innocent man who's being treated unjustly, if an innocent man who's suffering like a guilty man can maintain faith in God, how much more a guilty man for whom his suffering is justified? It's like the lights are beginning to go on in his head. And then I can't help but think it must have dawned on him, oh my, this is the Messiah. The sign above his head, wow, that's right. He is the King. And then through all the pain and through all the violence and through all the shouting, he turns his head toward Jesus, and here's what he says. Then he said, Jesus, remember me. Remember me when you come into your kingdom. It's a plea. It's a dying man's last request. Remember me. I see it. I get it. If you can maintain faith in a good God in the midst of things you're experiencing, then there must really be a good God who cares. There must really be a good God who's personal. And then Jesus answers him. And I love his answer in verse 43. He says, Jesus answered him, truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise. In spite of all you've done, you're going to be with me Not because you're promising to do better, because that's not going to happen. You're on a cross. It's done. There's no from now on and I promise and from here on out and I'll always and I'll never. No, there's none of that. There's none of I'm going to change my life coming from the cross. There's just a desperate plea for grace and mercy, and Jesus says, yeah, today you're going to be with me. Because my thoughts about you are not reflected in what's happening to you in this moment. My love for you is not reflected in what you're experiencing. I'm not, and my Father is not defined by your personal disappointments and your personal experiences. Now think about that. If that's true, I wonder if it's life that's left you broken. I wonder if it's the guy who ran this stoplight that left you broken. I wonder if it's the economy that changed your financial situation that left you broken. And it's not God at all. I wonder if it's your spouse that abandoned you, but not God. What if your life doesn't reflect the true nature of God at all? And I think this is Jesus' very last message before he dies, because his very last conversation before he dies is not with a righteous man. It's with probably one of the most unrighteous people in that whole area. That was his dying breath. That's who he's talking to right at the end. Because he wanted that man to know that there is a God who is so much greater than the life he's been experiencing, than the downfalls that he's had to go through in his life. And then Luke tells us what happens. This is kind of interesting. In verse 44, look what Luke tells us. He says, it was now about noon, and darkness came over the whole land. It'd almost be like an eclipse or something. And darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m, for the sun stopped shining. The whole land, from noon until 3 o'clock, is dark. And for several hours, Jesus hangs there in excruciating pain and excruciating misery. And in the darkness, Luke tells us there's something else that happens that is really huge. It's one of these things you can just skim by. Look at the rest of verse 45. And the curtain of the temple was torn in two. You know, what? We need to decorating now? In the middle of all this, we're talking about curtains? In the Jewish temple, there was this really super thick, heavy curtain that was 30 feet tall and 30 feet wide, floor to ceiling. And it hung between the Holy of Holies, a place in the temple. It was in the Old Testament tabernacle with Moses, and it was in the temple there in Jerusalem. It was between the Holiest of Holies. Now, the Holiest of Holies was this innermost sacred area of the temple that represented the dwelling of God, and nobody could go in there. Only the high priest could go in there one time a year. Okay? One time a year, this area was a cube. It was 30 by 30 by 30 tall. The Ark of the Covenant was in there. You know, the old, Indiana Jones stuff. The Ark of the Covenant was there. Okay, and there was a few other items in there, very few. And the high priest could only go in there one time a year. And this curtain separated the Holy of Holies from all the rest of the temple. In a very real sense, it separated the presence of God from the rest of the world. A priest had to go in there and deal with the sins of the people one time a year. That's the only time he could go in. And the scriptures tell us that when Jesus died, this curtain ripped from top to bottom, signifying that everyone was now welcome into the presence of God. No longer did you have to go through a person. No longer did you have to have a representative. Because at that moment, everything that separated every single man and every single woman from God had been taken care of through the death of Jesus Christ. And then we read this in the next verse, verse 46. It says, Jesus called out with a loud voice, and I love this again. He said, Father, Into your hands I commend my spirit. And there it is again, Father. The Father who could have stopped it all. The Father who could have kept all this from happening. The Father who could have saved him. He said, into your hands I commend my spirit. That's the Father he decided to trust. And then the verse goes on. When he had said this, he breathed his last. So here's the question. Is it possible? Is it possible, as you look at your relationship with God, that you've confused life with God and drawn conclusions about God because of what you've experienced? Have you drawn conclusions about God based on what's happened to you, based on prayers that you didn't have answered? Or loved ones that experienced things and went through things that you thought God should never allow them to have gone through? Have you concluded who God is because of your own experience? And it's very easy to do, and in some ways I want to say it's very natural to do. But I think this is the message from the cross. I think in a way Jesus is saying, man, if you forget everything else, would you please remember this? That God, my Father, is not defined by your life experiences. God can be trusted in spite of your experiences. See, God is not life. God is not your life. But God sent Jesus to bring you life, to intersect with your life in the reality of the experiences of your life. We as a church gather here very regularly because we've experienced the reality of a God straight in the middle of the reality of life. Many of us have. And here's the deal. Now, you will find in Jesus precisely what you have not found in life. That's why we gather here. That's why I follow Jesus today. You know why? You will find in Jesus precisely what you have not found in life. You have not found in life grace. You have not found in life mercy. You have not found in life unconditional love. Those things you will never get through life. And when you experience those in life, we can transfer that, and we don't experience those things in life, we transfer that to God. But God says, I want to give you precisely what you can't find in life. I want to give you something very different than what you're experiencing in life. I want to give you grace. I want to give you mercy. I want to give you love. See, in life, our man on the cross found condemnation. In Jesus, he found forgiveness. You don't find that in life a lot, do you? In life, he found all kinds of turmoil and unrest. In Jesus, he found peace. In life, he was lost. In Jesus, he was found. Because God is not defined by life. You know, if you choose to read the 4 biographies of Jesus, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which I encourage you to do, by the way. I do this all the time. I'm reading somewhere in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John nearly every single day of my life because I want to be reminded of the life of Jesus. But here's what you'll discover about the life of Jesus. That, Jesus took life right in the face. He didn't play the God card. He never played the God card. He experienced life really the same way you and I experience life. He didn't take shortcuts. He didn't go into a restaurant and say, I'm Jesus, corner table, quick service. You know, he had to wait like everybody. He didn't say, I'm thirsty water. Oh, that's so refreshing. He didn't do that at all. Not at all, not a single time. He knew what it meant to be lonely. He knew what it meant to be abandoned. He never leveraged being Jesus to make his life easier for himself. He knew what it felt like to have his Father say, no. So here's the takeaway that I want us to get from this morning. And that's this, that Jesus inside of his experiences had, and this is the phrase I want you to get, he had an in spite of life confidence in his Father. In spite of life, he had confidence in his Father. And he's paved the way for us to be able to live the same. That we can live and have an in spite of life confidence in God just as well. I've seen it so many times. I've experienced it a lot of times. And I've seen it in so many of you. So I love your stories. And sometimes it's just overwhelming. I've seen people again and again face all kinds of difficult circumstances and display an in spite of life confidence in God. And it's so awe-inspiring. I'm telling you, it really is. In fact, you're sitting around some of those people right now as I look across this room. But if you're not one of those people, because you may not be one of those people yet in your life, my hope is that you'll actually embrace the message of Jesus and you'll hear what he has to say from the cross. That, yeah, life happens. But God can be trusted. That, yeah, your disappointments are really, really real. And being disappointed is completely understandable. But you don't have to live life disappointed in God. You just don't. Because life's going to happen. But God can be trusted. Be a great way to live. Life's going to happen, but God can be trusted. And when you open your hands, and instead of clenching your fists in anger at God when things don't turn out, you decide, I'm not going there. I'm going to open up my hands. And say, God, now is when I need to experience your reality in the midst of this reality of life. I want to experience that grace. I want to experience that mercy. I want to experience that peace because what I'm experiencing may never leave. May never leave. You get in some accidents and you're going to be the same way the rest of your life. Some relationships break and they'll never be put back together again. Is that God? No. God says that I want to give you my grace and I want to give you my peace. I want to give you my joy in the midst of all of it. And when you do that, when you stop this, and you start this, and you say, God, I'm just going to give it up to you, what happens is you become a candidate for that life-giving, life-changing grace and the love of God as you begin to experience in your life. And this will have a huge effect on you. As you navigate realities that are going to happen to you, whether or not you follow Jesus. You can choose to follow Jesus or choose not to follow Jesus, and that same person might hit your car. You don't get a protective shield that nothing's going to happen to you. But what you get is the in spite of life confidence in a God that says, I'm with you and I'll never leave you and I'll walk you through it. And we'll come out the other side together. So I just want to ask as we finish off this series, man, I don't know where you are on some of this. But I just want to ask you clearly, are you willing to open up your hands in spite of what life has dished out to you? And stop going this and go this. It works a whole lot better.